Absolutely. And this is a critical issue that has not really been erased or discussed, I would say, in the broader geopolitical environment, or at least not that I have seen of late. And to provide just a bit of background, what you have with regard to what I'll refer to as the heartland theory, also known as the world island theory, and the maritime theory, have been ebbing and flowing, moving around over the course of the last 100 years, quite frankly. And what these two theories are is the maritime theory states that for geopolitical dominance and power, a nation state is meant to have dominance within the naval realm. So you would need bases, ships, all sorts of resources to support that naval superiority. And this makes sense if you think back on the last 600 years, going back to the Spanish, when you had the Spanish Armada, ultimately defeated by the English, but you had all of these Western European nations that had these navies that would go around and they would create their colonies or naval bases, and that is how they projected power. That was first introduced by a gentleman by the name of Alfred Mahan in 1790. It was that long ago. But what was fascinating was, if you fast forward a few years later, about 50 years later, a gentleman by the name of Mackinder came out with the heartland theory. And his argument was naval power wasn't necessarily the primary instrument to project power. You also needed to recognize that if you looked at the globe, you had this landmass from basically Western Europe all the way to China. That included Russia, included Turkey, includes India, and this was known as the world island. And his thesis stressed that whoever controlled the world island ran the world. Now again, going back prior to 1900, this thesis would never have made sense because all transportation was done on the seas. There were no railroads. Railroads were first introduced around 300 years ago, but at a very limited basis. By the time 1900 came around, you had the advent of petroleum, of oil. And oil really changed the dynamic of all transportation, both naval, but also more importantly, the entirety of building out a rail system. You saw it in the United States throughout the 18th and 19th century. And because of the rail system, you were able to then begin to take advantage of this heartland theory. Now, at the time Mackinder introduced the idea, it was hotly debated because you still had then not just Britain, but the United States building out its naval presence. So the Maritime thesis. Now, this combination of the two were debated amongst scholars, amongst geopolitical experts, amongst governments, diplomats. What then transpired, though, was World War I, World War II, which was the combination of these two theses. But then ultimately you had the Cold War. And during the Cold War, most would then argue that Mackinder's theory of the heartland failed. Because you had the Soviet Union, which for all intents and purposes had vast control over most of the heartland. And yet ultimately the Soviet Union failed. And the United States prevailed in that competition, and the United States prevailed, they would argue, due to having serious naval power to be able to move around the entire globe. And again, what's interesting is during that period of time, the United States built military bases, which they maintain to this very day, throughout the world, not just in Asia, but throughout Europe, even in South America to a certain extent. Fast forward to today, and I would argue that this debate is as important as it has ever been. And unfortunately, and the reason why I wanted to discuss it here, is I don't actually see it being discussed that much anywhere else. Now, why is it important? It's important because what I'm seeing out of China is a bit of a hybrid. And what I mean by hybrid is China has clearly worked to build out its naval projection of power. There are lots of commentary, even a great deal of concern out of places like Washington, D.C. and Europe, that China is able to build ships at a pace that far exceeds that of Europe and the United States. That's true, but there is no question to this very day that naval supremacy throughout the globe is still maintained by the United States. They have something like 12 carrier groups, and as I mentioned earlier, they have military bases to support those carrier groups throughout the world. So this is where the other side, back to the heartland theory, comes in. And we're seeing very clear moves made by China. And again, I think it's important to stress this. This is not about China attempting to project its power as a challenge to the United States. This is by no means the argument that I'm trying to make, nor do I firmly believe is the argument that the Chinese are themselves trying to project. The Chinese, in my opinion, are working on building as much optionality as they possibly can as a protection against any potential conflict that may occur, let's say, between the United States and China. If in fact there were some form of conflict, well, because of the Americans' superiority in the maritime theory with their naval power, what would happen to Chinese exports? Right now what we see is exports typically are produced here on the mainland, they get shipped to Shanghai or some other port city, they get put on a boat, and then they sail to wherever that is destined to be sold. Europe, the United States, what have you. So what we're now actually starting to see is, and I think this is fascinating just because of how recent this occurred, is China created a new rail system, really beginning in the city of Xi'an, so in the center of China, all the way to Iran, the city of Tehran. And it goes through all of what are called the stands, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and it's a really modern rail system that is meant for the sole purpose of being able to deliver exports to Europe much faster. I think the statistic was if on ship it takes 40 days to be able to transact from Shanghai to, let's say, Europe, by this train it takes about 14 days. And that's a certain benefit without question, but the real benefit is how, if there were any issue with regard to the exporting via the Maritime channel, this could be used where not just this rail system, but we think multiple rail systems will continue to be created that will go through this heartland. The other development that we saw just as important, perhaps some would argue even more important, was announced out of the more recent Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting in Tianjin 2 weeks ago or so. In that meeting, the Russians and the Chinese were finally able to come to an agreement. It's been discussed for years on a new natural gas pipeline that is called the Power of Siberia Mark II. They already have one relatively small, but what this pipeline is going to provide is all of the natural gas that predominantly used to go to Europe prior to the war in Ukraine is now going to be diverted from Russia to China. Now, it's going to take the better part of 5, maybe even 10 years for the construction of this pipeline to take place. But the fact that you have these major heartland powers of China and Russia recognizing the importance of being able to build a infrastructure that allows for protection and optionality against having to put natural gas on a ship, transport it to China in a different way. These are just 2 examples that I've seen, and 2 examples which have really developed just in the last several months. And I suspect you're going to see an increasing focus on the heartland because it includes places like India. And we know that India's President Narendra Modi attended the SCO meeting. So you've got Russia that has ample natural gas, ample energy, ample commodities, very cheap to produce. China has this massive ability to produce and manufacture. So the entire concept of the heartland theory, which again, to repeat myself, has not really been discussed as much as it should be, is already in play. And again, as I mentioned, what you will find is that China is operating both the hybrid. They're not just simply saying, we're going to go with the heartland theory and not look at the maritime theory. They're using both. And when I have conversations with various individuals and I try to bring this subject up, it is really surprising to me just how there's not a lot of understanding about the competition between these two types of approaches. I believe that the United States is beginning to recognize, as I mentioned, with all of the infrastructure that's being built throughout the heartland, that this will be something that needs to be taken into consideration. But it's an area that I myself am focusing on very much. It's an area that I will probably be discussing a lot more on these videos going forward as we begin to see real movement, real action being taken by not just China, but by all of the various countries in the heartland. Because here's where I'll end it. When Mackinder talked about the heartland, his argument was whichever country controls the heartland controls the world. Okay, but this is not about one country controlling the whole world. This is about the global south, a host of different countries that exist within the heartland, coming together, working collaboratively, and recognizing that doing so is the best for their own economic vitality, and most importantly, for maintaining the peace within that region. So we'll see how this plays out, and I'm looking forward to talking about this further in the weeks and months to come.